open theism is going to be, my prediction is, a bigger and bigger issue for us to cover in the church, because the online world is now governing the discussions.
Yeah.
Right. And
Right.
this thing is rising up. And so I'll come to it. I have so many things I'm preparing for right now. But,
Now, I'm just real quick. I mean, as we close here, and this will spark some comments, I'm sure, in the commentary, because I've got friends who are open theists who follow the podcast, and comment pretty often. But I have often said, I want to see if you agree with me on this, because I haven't heard your stuff on open theism yet. I have often said that I think that the open theists are making basically the same mistakes as our deterministic friends are. And by concluding, now they're both going in different directions, but they both conclude that if God foreknows a choice, then it must be determined. And therefore the open theist says, well, God doesn't foreknow our choices then. And
definitely
the determinists say, well, he determines our choices and we just got to deal with it.
Yeah. They hit the same fork in the road. Right. One goes left, one goes right.
Right.
And the fork is the belief that God's foreknowledge is determinism.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. If he knows what's going to happen, then it must be already set or fixed, and therefore determined by the one who knows it. And that's I think a modal fallacy, which we can get into, probably get into in your discussions. But here's the question I was going to get to: do you treat open theists just as much as brothers as you treat deterministic Calvinists?
Okay, so here's how I handle this. In my studies of open theism, I've mostly focused on, is it biblical? Like, what are the biblical, like, proof texts for open theism? What are the ones opposed to it? That's what I've focused on. I've also spent a little time on the philosophy of it and the idea of necessity versus certainty, and how those are different concepts, and that's too much to unpack at the moment. But those are the things I've focused on. Now, zooming out, does open theism inherently, like, conflict with Christianity? I think that there's a version of open theism where you can still be a Christian,
right?
Because you could even say God just chooses to not know what'll happen.
Yeah,
and I don't agree. I don't agree with that. Yeah. But I wouldn't call it apostate. I wouldn't call it that. Then there's another version of open theism where you're really calling into question some of God's very attributes, and it just starts to raise really serious question marks in my mind. Well, when I'm in doubt like that, I tend to treat people like they're Christians, because I'd rather be a little too gracious than not.
Yeah. But I guess the thing is, for me, both of them are making a philosophical mistake. Both of them if both of them are affirming genuine faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, trusting in Him for the atonement of their sins, but they're coming to different philosophical conclusions with regard to how to deal with omniscience, then I can no more throw out my open theist brothers than I can my deterministic brothers. Because, again, I think they're making the same philosophical quandary and a mistake. Now, that being said, here's the other point that I kind of have to push, is that if the determinist is wrong, and again, I'm not necessarily throwing all Calvinists in the deterministic bus, because some of them don't believe that, some of them actually affirm true libertarian free will somehow, inconsistently, but some of them do say we believe God, that the choice of salvation is not libertarianly free, but there are libertarianly free choices and all those kinds of things, and that's a very, very low form of Calvinism. That's not the obviously the statements of faith and the more scholarly perspective, but nevertheless, I'm not trying to throw all of them in the deterministic bus, but the system itself is theistic determinism. It's a form of compatibilism, which is theistic determinism. If they're wrong, their systematic, if properly applied, ultimately brings into question the attributes of God's character, His holiness, because you're ultimately having God determine sinful things that He's not determining. If open theism is wrong, they are bringing into question God's attributes of His ability to know future events. Which is worse, bringing into question God's character or His ability? Because again, both of those are wrong. We shouldn't do either one. We shouldn't question God's ability or His character. But I'm just telling, if you were spreading lies about me, I would much rather you spread lies about my inability to bench press what I can bench press, or inability to do some powerful thing or a good thing or whatever, some ability, than to impugn my character, to go around saying, hey, Leighton, his character is not good, or he's not trustworthy in that way. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not trying to pit determinist against open theism. I'm just saying, it seems to me, because open theism is relatively a newer way of thinking, and it's not has been established or known throughout the church, is that people tend to be more hard on it than the determinist. And those of us in the middle, I don't know that we should be very more hard on one of them than the other. I think both of them we need to stand firmly against and say, this is why we don't agree with what your conclusions are.
So here's
see what I'm saying?
The other side of it, right? Open theism, if I understand, the way people often come to open theism is it's an attempt at theodicy, at a defense of why God allows evil. And basically the part that's open theism says, hey, well, he didn't even know that was going to happen.
Right.
You can't blame him because he didn't know. And I would say that doesn't mean anything to me, because in the middle of the evil thing God didn't know about, now he knows. Why doesn't he stop it right then?
Right.
Like, you still have to deal with God allowing these things to happen. And so it doesn't really solve anything. All it does is potentially strip God of an attribute the Bible declares that he has.
Right.
And I know open theists are gonna be like, Mike, you don't understand our position. You're misrepresenting us.
Yeah.
And I will say, I think, and I could be wrong here, but I mean that sincerely. My studies so far show me you don't understand your position if you're an open theist and you say that. Right. It's not me. But look at like Greg Boyd and his stuff he says on open theism. I'm embarrassed to listen to what he says about it. I'd much rather hear a Calvinist talk about determinism, as far as what offends me more.
Really?
I'm embarrassed. He demonizes the Old Testament and demonizes a lot of the stuff that's in, and I'm going like, my goodness, are you an atheist? Like, what? This is what I hear from the atheists I deal with online. Now it's coming out of a Christian pastor.
But and then he thinks you make a good point. He seems to be trying to justify God by using his open theism to justify why these things happen theodicy wise, but it really doesn't help his case any, for the reasons you already mentioned. And I agree with you. I think that there are mistakes that systematic is making, and the thing is, I guess I don't find them any more grievous than the mistakes that our deterministic brothers are making. I find them both equally as grievous. In other words, I think they're both misinterpreting the text. I think they're both misinterpreting. I think they both come at it with a bad philosophy to begin with, in order to come to conclusions. But because one of them's newer or just now being more popularized doesn't make it more likely to damn you to hell. You know what I'm saying? If that makes sense. They're both of them are making mistakes that I think.
And I get what you're getting at, because you're like, you see Calvinism as at its core really compromising God's very character. And here's my question for you, right? Okay. If Calvinism's wrong, then it may very well at its core compromise God's very character because of the deterministic system. But let's just hypothetically say, if Calvinism was true, if total determinism was true, would you conclude that there was something wrong in the character of God?
If God determined me to, yeah.
No, I mean, not like that. You know what I mean? Like, sincerely,
well, that's true, though. Like, I mean, if you think if determinism is true, then I'm only going to do what God determined me to do. So I
mean, would you be logically consistent if you concluded that God is therefore somehow morally compromised because of determinism?
Okay. So if determinism is true, let's just pretend determinism is true.
Yeah, which I am 100% on board with you. It's not true. Yeah. It's not accurate.
Again, my brain is trying to work around this, because obviously if determinism is true, I'm only going to determine what God has determined for me to determine. But
the question's not what would you think if determinism was happening to you right now? Right. No, instead, it's a thought experiment, right?
Right. You're asking instead, would it therefore make God's character, would it impugn God's character if determinism is true?
Are you okay with the conclusion that God is morally wrong? That's where I go. I cannot go there. I
wouldn't. I mean, if I said the same thing about open theism, I would say the same thing. I mean, if open theism is true, I'd have to come to the conclusion that if it's true, it's true, and God's not morally evil. I mean, if you come to the Scripture with any presupposition, you come with a presupposition that God's good, that He's always just and He's always right. And therefore, if determinism is correct and God is always just and He's always right, then somehow, what J.I. Packer and others say, it's an antinomy. You just don't get it, Leighton, but somehow God's completely deterministic and He's not culpable, and you're just too dumb to get it, because God apparently determined for you to be too dumb to get it. So that's just the way that it is. And on the other side, if open theism is true, and we again come to the presupposition God's good and He's just and He's right, then I would still conclude that, okay, God doesn't know near as much as we thought He did know, but He's still good and just as right. And so you see what I'm saying? I think either way.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. I think that's it. To me, I go, I cannot entertain the idea, and I don't mean like emotionally, but I mean intellectually, I can't sustain the concept that Almighty God has some sort of moral flaw. And even if the world looked 100% like God somehow must be doing something wrong here, I would have to conclude I'm obviously wrong. Yeah. Like, God is God. And here the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I go, oh, Lord, I trust you. I don't understand it. And I wouldn't even have a defense. If someone asked me, my defense would be, God's good because He's God. And I will not let the circumstances of this time convince me that He's not good. So I tend not to use that concept of, like, some people say the Calvinistic God, and He is therefore like a bad God. And I go, you are treading on, in my mind, you're treading on dangerous ground when you make statements like that. So I would say I can understand how a deterministic God would make it very difficult to have a theodicy or to deal with the problem of evil. I don't know how I have a video on the problem of evil. I don't know exactly how I would make that video if I believed in determinism.
Right.
So I'm thankful that that's not the case.